The snow crunched beneath Thomas Sullivan's boots as he trudged up the hill toward the old cabin. The air was crisp and biting, his breath coming out in small clouds as he hauled his suitcase behind him. The winding drive had been treacherous, the roads barely visible through the heavy snowfall, and he was certain he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. Still, the cabin loomed in front of him now, a solitary silhouette against the backdrop of towering pines, and for a moment, he felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. Thomas reached the front door and fumbled with the keys. The lock resisted at first, like the house was trying to keep him out. But finally, with a rusty click, it gave way. He pushed the door open, and the musty scent of aged wood and cold air greeted him. It was exactly as he remembered it from years ago when his father had brought him here as a child. The furniture was outdated, the floors creaked with every step, and the fireplace, though grand, seemed more decorative than functional. He sighed heavily, setting his suitcase by the door. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. Solitude. The kind he hadn't had in months. The divorce had been a long, drawn-out disaster, and then his father's sudden death had upended his life once more. Thomas needed this. Time to think. Time to be alone with his thoughts, even if those thoughts were painful. He was here to reconnect. Or maybe disconnect. He wasn't sure yet. All he knew was that he needed to get away from the city, from the noise, from everything that reminded him of what he'd lost. After a few moments of surveying the room, Thomas went about lighting the fire. It took some effort. The wood was damp, and the flue hadn't been opened in what felt like decades. But soon enough, the flames caught, and warmth began to creep through the room. He stood before the hearth, rubbing his hands together, letting the fire thaw the chill from his bones. The cabin wasn't much, just a few rooms, each with its own layer of dust and age. The kitchen was cramped, the cupboards filled with expired cans and old spices that his father had never bothered to throw out. The bedroom was small, but functional. The bed covered in a thick quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. It was enough for now. He didn't plan on staying long. Just a week, maybe 2. Just long enough to clear his head. He moved upstairs to the attic, curious to see what his father had kept hidden up there all these years. The stairs creaked ominously beneath his weight as he ascended, and when he reached the top, he was greeted by a low, slanted ceiling and dusty wooden beams. The attic was filled with old furniture, crates of yellowed books, and a few scattered personal belongings. In the far corner, draped in a tattered cloth, something gleamed faintly. Thomas approached it, lifting the cloth to reveal a large, intricately designed snow globe. It was beautiful, in an eerie sort of way. The glass dome was thick and heavy, with flecks of dust clinging to its surface. Inside, a picturesque village sat nestled in a blanket of snow. Tiny houses lined the streets, their windows aglow with light, and miniature figures stood frozen in mid-motion, some shoveling snow, others gathered around a market stall. He stared at it for a moment, fascinated by the craftsmanship. The village was so detailed, so lifelike, that for a moment he thought he saw one of the tiny figures shift ever so slightly. He blinked and shook his head. "I'm just tired," he thought. He'd been driving for hours, and the weight of his emotions had started to take its toll. Still, there was something about the snow globe that felt familiar. It stirred a vague memory at the back of his mind, something he couldn't quite place. His father had never mentioned this snow globe before, and yet it felt like he'd seen it somewhere long ago. He brought it downstairs and placed it on the mantel above the fireplace. The glass caught the light from the fire, casting faint reflections across the walls. Thomas smiled faintly, admiring how peaceful the little village looked. It was serene, everything in its place, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. As the evening wore on, Thomas tried to settle in. He made himself some tea and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. Outside, the snow continued to fall, heavy and thick, blanketing the world in white. It reminded him of simpler times, winters spent at this very cabin, his father teaching him how to light the fire, how to track animals in the snow. His father had loved this place, though Thomas had never understood why. The isolation had always seemed more oppressive than peaceful to him. Now, though, he could see the appeal. He felt strangely at ease, cocooned in warmth while the world outside disappeared beneath layers of snow. The wind howled faintly against the cabin walls, but inside it was quiet. Just the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic ticking of an old clock. Thomas leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes. His thoughts drifted, wandering through memories both recent and old. The divorce had been a mess. His ex-wife had taken almost everything, and what little was left had been consumed by lawyers and court fees. He'd come here to escape that, to get some clarity. But all he felt now was an empty ache in his chest. As he dozed off, a faint sound reached his ears, like a soft whisper carried on the wind. His eyes snapped open, and he sat up straight, listening intently. But the sound was gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of the wind outside. He shook his head, chuckling softly at his own paranoia. It's just the wind, he thought. Nothing more. Still, the feeling of unease lingered. Before heading to bed, he glanced up at the snow globe one last time. The village inside looked the same as before. Perfectly still. Perfectly peaceful. But as he turned to leave, he hesitated. Something about the scene caught his eye. One of the tiny figures, an old man near the center of the village, seemed to have shifted slightly, his arm raised just a little higher than before. Thomas blinked, his breath catching in his throat. He stared at the globe for a long moment, heart pounding in his chest. But the figure remained still, frozen in place like the rest of the village. Shaking his head, he turned away and made his way to the bedroom, trying to push the strange feeling aside. The fire continued to crackle behind him, casting long shadows across the room. But as he lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, the whisper of the wind outside seemed to grow louder, more insistent. And though he tried to ignore it, sleep eluded him. Somewhere, deep in the quiet of the night, a faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred within the snow globe. One of the tiny houses flickered with light, as though a candle had just been lit inside. The figures in the village remained still. But for the briefest moment, it felt as though the entire scene had come alive. But Thomas was already lost in restless dreams, unaware of the tiny world that watched him from the mantel. The next morning, Thomas awoke to an unsettling quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, unnatural. He sat up slowly, blinking away the remnants of his restless dreams, and glanced toward the small window by his bed. Outside, the world was a blank canvas of white. Snow had piled high against the glass, nearly blocking out the pale light of day. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up, shivering as the cold air crept under his skin. The fire had gone out sometime during the night, leaving the cabin frigid. Thomas sighed and wrapped his blanket around himself, trudging toward the fireplace to rekindle the flames. As he worked, his thoughts lingered on the strange whispers he'd heard before falling asleep. He tried to convince himself it was just the wind, but a lingering doubt gnawed at him, persistent and uncomfortable. Once the fire was roaring again, casting warmth and light back into the room, Thomas turned his attention to the snow globe. It still sat on the mantel, the small village inside as still and peaceful as ever. Yet, something about it seemed different. He couldn't pinpoint what had changed, but the sight of it unsettled him. The memory of the figure that had shifted ever so slightly nagged at him, a puzzle piece out of place in his mind. He shook off the feeling and walked to the window. The snow had continued to fall overnight, blanketing everything in a thick, suffocating layer of white. The storm had grown worse, the winds howling outside like a pack of ravenous wolves. He was completely snowed in, no getting out today. Maybe not for several days. Thomas cursed under his breath. He had expected some snowfall. He was in the mountains after all, but nothing like this. The weather reports hadn't predicted a storm of this magnitude. His phone showed no signal either, a solid reminder of his isolation. He felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. After a hasty breakfast, Thomas decided to distract himself by exploring the cabin further. There had to be something useful hidden away in the attic or closets. Tools. maybe even a shovel he could use once the storm let up. But as he rummaged through the old boxes and closets, his mind kept drifting back to the snow globe. He couldn't shake the nagging sense that there was something wrong with it. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. He found himself standing in front of the mantel once more, staring down at the miniature village. The figures inside seemed even more lifelike today. He could make out individual details, the way the snow dusted their tiny coats, the expressions etched onto their faces, the way their eyes glinted with tiny specks of light. He swore he saw the faintest flicker of movement from one of the figures standing near a market stall, a slight tilt of the head. He leaned closer, his breath fogging up the glass. The village was perfect, serene even, but the longer he stared at it, the more it unnerved him. His father had never mentioned this thing, never said a word about it. But his father had become a bit of a recluse in the last few years, secretive in a way Thomas hadn't understood. Maybe this was just one of those strange obsessions his father had never spoken of. Suddenly, a loud bang rattled the cabin, jolting Thomas out of his thoughts. His heart leapt into his throat as he whipped around, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was empty. The sound had come from outside. A large branch, perhaps, knocked loose by the storm and crashing against the side of the cabin. He moved to the window and peered out into the blinding white. For a moment, Thomas thought he saw something moving in the distance, a dark shape shifting between the trees, barely visible through the swirling snow. He squinted, but the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the storm. A shiver crawled down his spine. "Get it together, Tom," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia that had been growing since he'd arrived. It was just the storm playing tricks on his mind. He retreated to the kitchen to make some coffee, hoping the warmth would settle his nerves. As he stood by the stove, waiting for the water to boil, his mind wandered back to his father. There was something about all of this that felt strangely connected to him. He remembered his father becoming more withdrawn in his final years, rarely leaving the cabin, consumed by something that Thomas never quite understood. Once the coffee was made, Thomas sat at the small kitchen table, sipping it slowly, staring into the crackling fire. The unease lingered, but he tried to focus on the present. He told himself this was just a storm, a temporary inconvenience. Soon enough, the snow would stop, and he could dig himself out. Everything would return to normal. But deep down, he didn't believe that. As the day wore on, Thomas found himself drawn back to the snow globe again and again. Each time he looked at it, he swore the village had changed in some subtle way. The snow in the globe seemed to fall in real time, its pace matching the storm outside. The light inside the tiny houses flickered and dimmed, almost as though the village was preparing for some sort of catastrophe. It wasn't until late afternoon that he noticed something even more disturbing. One of the tiny figures near the center of the village, an old man hunched over with a cane, looked eerily familiar. Thomas leaned in closer, squinting at the figure, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure had his father's face. Thomas recoiled, nearly dropping the globe as he stumbled back. He clutched his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. It was impossible. His father was dead. He hadn't been here for years. And yet the figure looked exactly like him. His father, frozen in time, trapped inside the glass. He backed away slowly, refusing to look at the globe again. His mind raced with explanations. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a trick of the light. But no matter how he rationalized it, the image of his father's face, frozen inside that tiny village, lingered in his mind. By nightfall, Thomas was on edge. Every small creak of the cabin made him jump. Every gust of wind sent a chill down his spine. He could hardly bear to look at the snow globe, but he found himself drawn to it all the same. The whispers he'd heard last night seemed louder now, almost intelligible, as though they were calling to him from somewhere just beyond the edge of the storm. He sat in front of the fire, staring into the flames, but the warmth did little to soothe him. The snow globe sat on the mantel, silent and still, yet filled with an almost palpable tension. Something was wrong. Deeply, horribly wrong. That night, Thomas dreamed again. He found himself walking through the village inside the snow globe, the snow crunching beneath his boots just as it had outside the cabin. The streets were empty, the tiny houses dark and foreboding. He wandered through the narrow alleys, feeling eyes on him from every window, though he could see no one. The village was eerily quiet, save for the soft whispers carried on the wind. As he turned a corner, he saw a figure standing in the distance, its back turned to him. Thomas approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, the figure slowly turned to face him. It was his father. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and frozen. He didn't speak, but his gaze bored into Thomas's soul, a silent warning that chilled him to the bone. Thomas tried to speak, to ask his father what was happening, but his voice wouldn't come. He stood frozen in place, staring into the dead eyes of the man he had once known, and felt the world around him begin to warp and twist. The snow beneath his feet began to sink, dragging him down into the icy depths. He woke with a start, gasping for breath, his heart racing. The cabin was dark, the fire nearly out. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of dread lingered, heavy and oppressive. He looked toward the mantel. The snow globe sat there, undisturbed, the village inside as peaceful as ever. But Thomas knew now that it was anything but peaceful. Something was very, very wrong with that globe, and with this place. And whatever it wasn't finished with him yet. Thomas stumbled through the cabin door, dragging the snow globe with him like a curse bound to his soul. The air outside was like a wall of icy wind, the snow whipping violently around him as the storm reached its fever pitch. He had no plan, no sense of direction. Only the raw, primal need to get away, to distance himself from the cabin, from the snow globe, from the voices. The wind roared in his ears, the storm swallowing the world around him. All he could see was endless white, and all he could hear were those maddening whispers carried on the gusts of frozen air. But he pushed forward, determined to break free from whatever nightmare had ensnared him. He clutched the snow globe to his chest, its glass surface cold against his skin, the weight of it unnatural, as though it had become heavier the longer he held it. His breath came in short, panicked bursts as he fought his way through the storm. It didn't feel like he was outside anymore. It felt like the boundaries of reality had blurred, like he was trapped in some in-between space. Somewhere between the real world and the twisted miniature village inside the snow globe. The landscape shifted and twisted, changing from familiar to unrecognizable with every step. The trees seemed to bend and warp, their dark shapes stretching out like grotesque figures looming over him. The ground beneath his feet no longer felt solid. It was like walking on shifting sand, unstable, impossible to get a foothold. And then, through the swirling snow, he saw it. The village. It stood before him, perfectly formed, just as it had been inside the snow globe. Only now it was life-sized, as real as the world he had left behind. The tiny houses, the dimly glowing windows, the narrow streets, they were all here, just as they had been inside the glass. And in the center of the village square, the figures were waiting. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he staggered forward, drawn toward the village as though something unseen was pulling him in. The storm seemed to calm as he approached, the wind dying down to a low, almost eerie whisper. The snow still fell in thick, heavy flakes, but the village remained perfectly still, untouched by the violence of the storm. The figures in the square were just as he had seen them before. His father, standing tall and imposing, and beside him, the smaller figure that mirrored Thomas himself. Their faces were blank, expressionless, their eyes empty, voids that seemed to stare right through him. "No," Thomas whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "This can't be real. This isn't happening." But the village was real. The snow globe had become his reality, twisting his world into the frozen nightmare it contained. He could feel it. This place had power, a dark, malevolent force that had drawn him in, just as it had drawn in his father before him. The storm closed in around him, the air growing colder with every passing moment. Thomas's breath fogged in the air as he approached the figures, his hands trembling. He still held the snow globe in his hands, the glass now glowing faintly in the dim light of the village. As he drew closer, he could see the faint details on his father's face, the stern lines, the tight-lipped expression, the cold, dead eyes. And the figure beside him, his own doppelganger, stood eerily still, its face an exact reflection of his own, only devoid of life. Thomas felt a surge of panic rise in his chest, and he looked down at the snow globe in his hands. This was the key. It had to be. If he could destroy it, if he could shatter the glass, maybe he could break free of this nightmare. With trembling hands, he lifted the snow globe above his head, ready to hurl it to the ground with all his strength. But as he stood there, poised to strike, something stopped him. The village around him seemed to shift, the air growing heavier, thicker. The figures in the square turned their heads in unison, their eyes locking onto him with a terrifying intensity. The wind picked up again, but now it carried a new sound. Something deeper, more powerful than the whispers he had heard before. It was a voice. A single deep voice that echoed through the village, vibrating in his bones. Thomas. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was unmistakable. It was his father's. But it wasn't coming from the figure in the square. It was coming from everywhere, surrounding him, pressing in on him from all sides. Thomas, the voice repeated, louder this time. You cannot escape. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, his eyes darting frantically across the village. The buildings seemed to loom closer, the shadows growing longer, darker. The world around him felt like it was closing in, like the walls of the snow globe were tightening, compressing, trapping him inside. No, Thomas screamed, his voice raw with desperation. I won't let you do this to me. With a surge of adrenaline, he brought the snow globe down with all his might, aiming to shatter it against the frozen ground. But the moment the globe made contact, something impossible happened. The ground beneath him rippled like water, distorting the world around him. The village, the figures, the storm, they all seemed to stretch and warp, like a reflection in a shattered mirror. The force of the impact reverberated through the air, but the snow globe didn't break. Instead, the glass surface cracked, just slightly, a thin spiderweb of fractures spreading across the globe. And as the cracks appeared, the world around Thomas began to fall apart. The village square crumbled, the buildings collapsing into dust, the figures dissolving into nothingness. The storm howled once more, but now it felt like the wind was inside him, tearing at his very soul. The ground beneath his feet gave way and Thomas felt himself falling, tumbling into the abyss, the snow globe still clutched in his hands. For a brief moment, everything was silent, still, empty. And then, with a sudden jolt, Thomas hit solid ground. He gasped for breath, blinking rapidly as he tried to regain his bearings. He was no longer in the village, no longer in the storm. He was back in the cabin, lying on the cold wooden floor, the fire in the hearth nothing but embers. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. The snow globe was still in his hands, but now the cracks had spread further across its surface, the glass on the verge of shattering completely. Inside, the village was gone, replaced by swirling white, like a miniature storm contained within the globe. For a moment, Thomas dared to hope that it was over, that he had escaped. But then he felt it, a presence, something cold, dark, watching him from just beyond the edge of his vision. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room, and there, standing in the corner, was the figure of his father. But this time, it wasn't frozen. It wasn't a lifeless statue. It was moving. The figure stepped forward, its eyes locking onto Thomas with a cold, malevolent gaze. The air in the cabin grew colder, the shadows lengthening as the figure approached. Thomas backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked down at the snow globe in his hands, the cracks spreading further, the glass starting to splinter. He knew what he had to do. With one final desperate effort, Thomas lifted the snow globe above his head and brought it down against the floor with all his strength. The glass shattered. For a moment, there was silence. The room went still, the air heavy with anticipation. And then, slowly, the world around Thomas began to dissolve. The walls of the cabin crumbled, the fire in the hearth flickered and died, and the cold, dark presence that had haunted him for so long began to fade. Thomas felt a strange sense of relief wash over him as the world dissolved into nothingness. He had done it. He had broken the curse. He was free. But as the last remnants of the cabin disappeared, replaced by an endless white void, Thomas realized something. He wasn't free. He was inside the snow globe. The world around him was cold, silent, and still. The snow fell gently from an unseen sky, and the air was filled with a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. And there, in the distance, he saw it. The village. It stood in the center of the void, just as it had before, its narrow streets lined with snow-covered houses. And in the village square, two figures stood waiting. His father, and himself. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. He hadn't escaped. He had simply become a part of the snow globe, trapped forever in the frozen nightmare that had claimed his father before him. The snow fell softly around him, the world silent and still. And as Thomas stared at the village, his heart heavy with despair, he knew that he would never leave. He was part of the snow globe now, part of its secrets, forever. In the quiet of the cabin, the shattered remains of the snow globe lay on the floor, the tiny village inside frozen in time. And in the center of the village square, two figures stood, watching over the world that had claimed them. Forever.